Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Lifetime Legacy Lawyer Podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Thomas Vick, joined by the other co-host on this podcast, Seth Wilson. Seth, how's it going today?
Thomas, I am doing well. Thanks for asking. We are just excited to be back on the mic with you. I always look forward to our time of recording and just kind of chatting about ideas in estate planning. So we were kind of chatting before we started recording about an upcoming seminar that you're giving, and we were talking about the concepts and some of the things about how to really distill some of the options that are available, especially as you think about maybe Medicaid or long-term care planning. And so I thought, hey, might as well talk about it here because you've already gotten it ready for the presentation as well. And it may be helpful even for those who might be able to attend to come back and listen to the example there and work that through. So tell us kind of what's going on with that and then some of the concepts that you came up for that.
Yeah, so I've got an upcoming seminar. Some of the clients on my email list have gotten an invite for that. And just really looking forward to spending some time with folks that I've met before, some folks I haven't met before. And what we're going to be talking about is how to manage your estate properly. And one of the points that I'm going to make in there is that estate planning, proper planning really deals with your lifetime and also after death. Sometimes when we think about estate planning, we're just thinking about who's going to get all the stuff when I pass away, but there's so much that happens or could happen between now and our passing that we really need to plan for. And so that's sort of the overall theme of the seminars. Make sure that we're planning for our lives as well as upon our passing.
And great, it's so amazing to me when you think about the responsibility that is as an estate planning lawyer to help clients navigate this, because as you mentioned, a lot of times folks are coming to us because, hey, we want to make sure that if something happens to us, our kids are protected, our things are protected, those kind of questions. And it's interesting to watch as we kind of go through the documents and what you might need to have a well-rounded estate plan. How many folks said, well, I never really thought about, if I have an incapacitating event during life and am not able to manage my affairs for a while. And so it's such a fulfilling practice area because we get to help folks navigate that. And I think that's part of the basis of these types of seminars is our continued commitment to educating folks on really what options are available.
Yeah, and you talk about protecting oneself, but also protecting beneficiaries. And I think about what actually is the threat that we need to protect against. And, there are so many different things that could happen, some foreseeable, some not so much. But, one thing that is foreseeable is just getting, the failure to get an estate plan in place is a threat in and of itself. If a person does not have an estate plan and then suffers a stroke or develops dementia or Alzheimer's and is now unable to make decisions for himself, then their loved ones are going to have to go to court and get a guardianship. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be discussing at the seminar coming up, just the process and how cumbersome it is, time-consuming and costly from a money standpoint, to make sure that individuals who care about somebody are able to make decisions for that individual. And it can really trip a lot of people up just because they don't have an estate plan in place at all.
Yeah, and what are, you think that through of what are some of the considerations there, because even if you do have a power of attorney in place, if you've named someone who maybe shouldn't be there or you're trying to protect personal feelings in a case, on occasion, you can end up creating a challenging scenario in the event something happens to you. And so the objectivity of the lawyer going, we don't really necessarily have the same familial relationship that you might with someone. We're not as offended potentially if we don't get named in a document kind of thing, we can help ask those questions and say, well, have you thought about this scenario? What happens if they don't agree, if they're designated as your powers of attorney? And kind of walk through some of those questions as well.
Yeah, and making sure that your selections are robust. So maybe you're thinking about, these 3 children are, nearby and able to help, but I've got a 4th child that, lives in some other state, maybe California or something like that. And you don't think that 4th child should be in the plan whatsoever. But nothing really wrong with that child, no hard feelings or anything. You just don't think they're not going to be available. Well, it would be a doomsday scenario, but why not just go ahead and tack that person's name on at the bottom of the list so that individual will have authority too if, the 3, for whatever reason, tragedy strikes and, they're not available to help as power of attorney. You might as well just add everybody that you can. Have as many people in that document. I wouldn't say a dozen, but have all your kids on there that you feel comfortable are able to make decisions for you if the time comes, so that they're not having to go to court and ask permission from a judge to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think too, as we look at the overall estate for someone and kind of thinking about, we're not financial planners in that sense, but we often work in conjunction with a financial planner to help carry out those terms. And you may think about, well, do I, put the insurance or the child's name on the vehicle, or get insurance in their own name? Or we've got experience in those scenarios where we can kind of help think through, okay, what are the issues? What assets may be at issue if there is an accident for someone driving a car? And how do you want to make sure that particular scenario is protected? What do we do in this case or that case? And it's really a fun time to kind of talk through and just bring that life experience to bear on that client's estate. And it's not just set it and forget it. Although, we often talk about we're planning for what we reasonably know and can reasonably anticipate, but we're also get the opportunity to come alongside, that's the podcast is called That Lifetime Legacy Lawyer. We want to walk alongside our clients for their lifetime and help them address those questions as they arise.
Yeah, certainly. And kind of, again, the theme that I'm sort of going with is protecting against certain threats. And another threat that is out there, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but is tax implications. And one of those tax implication scenarios is, what if I just give my house to my son, my adult son, who lives in another house with his own family? He's settled, but I want him to have the house. What happens in that case? And unfortunately, that can have some unfortunate tax implications when it's done that way.
Yeah, and those are intriguing questions because there's so many different types of taxes, and I think whenever somebody asks me, well, how do I protect the estate against taxes, we've got to unpack that just a little bit more to see what is it that we're really talking about. Is it a transfer tax? Is it an estate tax? Is it a capital gains tax? Is it an income tax? Is it the list goes on, right? And so that's a big part of, I think, what you mentioned there is just sometimes there is an unintended consequence as a result of a relatively simple, quote unquote, solution that can be presented to an issue. And it causes that, we talk about this, that downstream impact of, I changed something up here and maybe down the road didn't really think all of that through. And that's where the lawyer can be really helpful to help avoid some of those challenges.
For sure. And I often encourage people to place real estate into a trust so that you have a step-up basis when the individual passes away, when the grantor passes away, so that there are limited tax consequences when that when that comes up. But then, you know, in the back of your head, you also got to be thinking about property taxes. That was one of the, maybe the only one that you didn't mention in your list there, property taxes. Who's going to pay the property taxes? Can that adult child pay the property taxes? Can they afford it? So tax implications can be a threat that, you know, estate planners need to help clients through. And then long-term care expenses, and that's the big one. And I'm an elder law attorney, so that's where I spend a great deal amount of my time. How can I protect assets for, you know, spouses that are healthy, but they're, you know, they have a spouse that's in the nursing home or is sick? And then how can we protect assets for the next generation? How can we transfer these assets to the next generation so that they can have that blessing and be able to use it wisely? Long-term care expenses are just huge. I mean, for a semi-private room in a nursing home, it's approximately $94,000 a year in the Indianapolis area, which is just outrageous. And you know, people, you know, it's not uncommon for folks to come see us, and they've got a few $100,000 in savings, you know, retirement savings, and they may have some equity built up in a principal residence. But if you're draining $100,000 every 12 months, that's going to put a huge dent in an individual's estate. So what discussions do we need to have in order to protect against that? How can I make some plans so that I'm not going to have to spend $100,000 every year if I were to get sick? And that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about in my upcoming seminar.
Yeah, and it's such a great opportunity to learn what options do exist. And the time to ask the question, as we always say, is now. You know, what are those examples, and what scenarios might you be facing in the future that you want to be aware of or have on your radar screen, so you can kind of say, boy, this is trending in this direction. Maybe we need to start taking some steps to address those situations sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and there are a few different avenues of paying for long-term care expenses. So one is essentially what I just said, private paying, just continuing to write the check and pay for it as you go, as they say. But there are other options. You know, if you plan far enough in advance, you could maybe get a long-term care insurance policy. You know, there are a couple companies in Indiana that are still doing the Indiana partnership policy, which is great. It's expensive, but it's great to have it if you can afford it. Or it might be that you need to use a hybrid life insurance policy. Some of these new products that financial advisors are offering allow for an individual to get some life insurance while also getting not just the death benefit, but being able to use the death benefit towards long-term care expenses while an individual is living. So that could be an option. VA aid and attendance is an option as well for those that are in assisted living or living at home, but they need some assistance with activities of daily living. The VA aid and attendance program can really help out for wartime veterans or their surviving spouses. So those are some options, but the great majority of us are in the Medicaid space. You know, individuals really have to get down, when it comes down to it, have to apply for Medicaid if they're going to be able to afford to have an individual to have a loved one in the nursing home. And so, you know, there are rules to that. You know, you can't have a bunch of money and still make, you know, still qualify for Medicaid. You got to go through the rules and make sure that you're following the rules. And that's where elder law attorneys can get creative. We have a lot of options available for us about how can we get individuals qualified. But probably the best starting place is to pre-plan by using a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust. You know, a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust separates you and your assets just enough that Medicaid will not count it as a countable asset. Instead, it will be considered a transfer, and you make that transfer when you think that you have 5 years before you're going to need long-term care. And, in my seminar, I'm going to go through how a Medicaid asset protection trust can really benefit a couple different families. One a married couple, and then one a widower. Both of them use the Medicaid asset protection trust, but in the end, the vast majority, if not the entirety of their estate, is protected from long-term care expenses.
Yeah, and great tools, but you were speaking there, and I'm thinking, boy, there are just so many different variables and questions and things, and we say this a lot, that each situation is so fact dependent. I mean, you mentioned VA benefits, and if I was in the military, does that count? Well, maybe. Were you a wartime veteran? Were you not? Were you, there's all of these sort of questions behind the question to determine whether this plan or that plan may work. And so those are all things that are great, and the more information you can provide to an attorney, the better off you are, because there may be something that you didn't think was all that important, but could have been really, really important for you in terms of, my spouse had served in combat and is no longer with us, or something along those lines. It may open up a whole new pathway of opportunities that weren't there under a traditional scenario. And so it's just a almost mind-boggling array of options that are there. And I'm fortunate in my practice to have you to call when I say, boy, I think there's something here, but what are we missing from an elder law perspective? That's very helpful to tie the estate planning and the elder planning together. And so I think that's a great resource, and appreciate you being willing to offer that back out through the various seminars and this podcast.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be able to offer that advice. And, it's one of the honors that I have to be able to tell clients, no, everything's going to be fine. You're going to protect all your assets. We're going to be able to protect at least this much. We know that, there's going to be some end to the pain, if you will, financially speaking. And I can help them navigate that. And it's very, very special to be able to do that. But it is a maze sometimes. It is a maze. How do I gather everything together, make sure that we've got everything that we need to report to Medicaid, and then provide Medicaid with that information, have the discussions with Medicaid that you have to have. But then at the end of the day, the individual who needs care receives the care that they need, and that's really what's most important.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this earlier, it is really a fulfilling practice area to really be proactive. Many things that we do in the law as attorneys are very reactive to a scenario that has happened in the past, and we're trying to help navigate what that looks like. Whereas with your estate planning and with elder law planning, if it's done ahead of time, we can really put together a very good plan and navigate, the threats to your estate.
Yes. The threats to the estate are many. I just named a few of them: procrastination, tax implications, long-term care, bad apples in the family. All of those things can come into play. But pre-planning for Medicaid, for long-term care expenses, that's probably the most important thing to consider when the priority is protecting assets from long-term care. Doing your work ahead of time is critical, and if you do, then the results are really, really good. An elder law attorney can do immediate crisis planning for Medicaid, but even in those situations, it's a lot easier if there's been some work on the front end years prior.
Yeah, and we didn't get into any of the other fun stuff that you can do in terms of charitable giving and the alphabet soup of all the options for charitable trusts and those kind of things. So maybe that'll be a topic for another episode.
I think we know what we're going to talk about next week. Well, I don't have anything else on that topic, Seth. How can people get in touch with you?
Thomas, we are located in the heart of Hamilton County here in Noblesville, Indiana, and that's our web address, noblesvilleattorney.com. How about yourself?
The best way to get in touch with me is by going to vicklaw.org, vicklaw.org, and book a call.
Awesome.
Yep, that does it for today. Appreciate it as always. We'll see everybody next time.
Sounds good, Thomas.